So last year, I visited Binghamton, and while I was there, I noticed this innocuous building along Lewis Street. But upon walking around, I noticed that it was also beside a set of tracks. I decided to film it, just in case I would decide to make a video about this, and today, that time has come. It's April 7th, 1832, and the Leggett's Gap Railroad has just been incorporated. However, it didn't do much for about 20 or so years, until it was renamed to the Lackawanna and Western Railroad in 1851. It was decided that it would run from Scranton, Pennsylvania, to the Great Bend just south of the border between New York State and Pennsylvania. Then, the company was able to obtain rights to run their trains on tracks that belonged to the New York and Erie Railroad. This allowed the L&W to extend service to Owego, New York. This extension, by the way, included a station at Binghamton, but I'll get to that later. So, at Owego, the company leads the... Oh boy, I'm definitely not pronouncing that. Anyways, now the Lackawanna and Western Railroad ran up to Ithaca. Now back in 1850, a new railway company was chartered, the Delaware and Cobb's Gap Railroad. 3 years later, in 1853, that company would merge with the Lackawanna and Western Railroad into the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. In order to get trains running into central New Jersey, the Warren Railroad was chartered to connect the DLW to the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Now, I'm going to interject the story for a bit here. I know my channel is titled Travel in New York, yet some of the aspects of this video don't even take place in it. So, if you want to see actual content that focuses on transportation outside of New York, let me know in the comments. Because the Central Railroad of New Jersey could be a good place to start. Or, I could also do something more simpler like the abandoned Binghamton Bridge. Okay, so back to the main topic. The Warren Railroad opened on May 27, 1856, and soon after, a third railway was installed on the Central Railroad of New Jersey to allow trains from the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad to go east to Elizabeth. In 1868, the company bought the Morris and Essex Railroad, which ran east to west across New Jersey and intersected the Warren at Washington. The railroad also provided access to New Jersey City without relying on the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Under the DLW's control, the ME built a tunnel to reach New Jersey City so it wouldn't have to use the tunnel owned by the New York, Lake Erie, and Western Railway. The late 1860s and the early 1870s was a time for expansion for the DLW, in which they took control of other railroad companies to use their track for many other branches. On March 3, 1869, the Valley Railroad was created to connect the terminus at the Great Bend, Pennsylvania, to Binghamton, New York. Again, I'll eventually get back to Binghamton Station in this video. In 1880, the New York, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad was chartered to extend DLW service west from Binghamton to Buffalo, near the U.S.-Canadian border. Now, as the 20th century arrived, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad continued their usual trend of taking over other railroad companies and expanding. In 1907, the company built a train terminal in Hoboken, which would eventually become the New Jersey Transit and Pass Station that we know today. In 1908, the Lackawanna Railroad of New Jersey was chartered to build the Lackawanna Cutoff to provide a high-speed service from Hoboken to Buffalo. It was eventually opened in 1911 with the construction of new viaducts. 2 of these viaducts, the Delaware River Viaduct and the Pollenskill Viaduct, are abandoned, but still standing, and you can actually walk on them as well. They provide some pretty amazing views, so you should definitely go visit them someday. A popular destination that could be reached with the railroad was the Pocono Mountains. It was this popularity that justified the main line to have 3 tracks and 4 tracks in some places. In addition to the passenger trains, the railroad would also be utilized to transport freight, such as coal, dairy, cattle, lumber, steel, cement, and grain. Unfortunately, a post-World War II era would result in a decline of traffic for both freight and passengers. Massive changes in the industry department, like natural gas becoming a preferred source of energy over coal or textiles industries, which were moving to the south, caused the railroad to be less used. To add insult to injury, in 1955, major floods took out 60 miles of track, resulting in 80 deaths. The entire railroad was shut down, and damage costs ran up to $8.1 billion, $78 million in today's money. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad would never recover from this, and instead, its decline was imminent. Then, in January of 1959, a flood in Knox Mine, Pennsylvania solidified their eventual downfall. Additionally, a post-World War II era consisted of more trucks and automobiles taking over all the traffic, which led to an economic downturn. In fact, many railroad companies in the Northeast would go bankrupt because of this. In 1955, with Hurricane Diane threatening bankruptcy for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, the president of the company, Perry Shoemaker, proposed to merge with the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, which would give way to many more destinations. It would also allow the tracks between Buffalo and Binghamton to be kept and saved from abandonment. However, the financial situation of the DLW did not justify this merger. In 1956, Shoemaker turned to the Lehigh Valley Railroad and the Delaware and Hudson Railroad to make potential agreements with them, but nothing happened with that too. Finally, he was able to merge his company with, out of all of the railroad companies, their longtime rival, the Erie Railroad. Remember them from earlier? Anyways, the DLW and Erie combined to form the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad on October 7, 1960. However, Shoemaker expressed regret for making this deal, as he retired from the company and eventually became the president of the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Following this merger, many trains of the DLW were rerouted on the Erie Railroad's track, as passenger service on the railroad was discontinued on January 6, 1970, in favor of freight transportation. In 1972, the Central Railroad of New Jersey abandoned its operations in Pennsylvania, which caused more trains to be run on the Erie and Lackawanna Railroad between Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Scranton, Pennsylvania. However, all of this could not shy away from financial problems, decline in coal shipments, a rise in taxes, and labor costs. Furthermore, the opening of the Interstates I-80, I-380, and I-81 during the early 1970s took traffic from the railroad east of Binghamton and onto trucks. By 1976, the Erie and Lackawanna Railroad was getting desperate, and so it turned to a regional railroad called Conrail, which was created in April of that year. All of the EL's property was handed over to Conrail. Then in 1979, the Lackawanna cutoff was officially abandoned, with tracks being removed in 1984. But since then, there were actually proposals to revive sections of the line. Now Conrail also agreed to other companies buying out certain sections of the railroad. These companies included the Delaware and Hudson Railway, the Norfolk and Southern Railway, and even the New Jersey Transit had a piece of the cut, with them taking over most of the Morris and Essex Railroad in Gladstone and Hackettstown, and combining the Montclair branch with the Boonton branch. Then, in 1996, the Kearney connection opened, which allowed trains on the Morris and Essex Railroad to run on the Northeast Corridor, which would allow them to run into Penn Station. Following the breakup of Conrail in 1999, the track from Scranton to Slateford was taken over by the Pennsylvania Northeast Regional Railroad Authority, a company that oversees railroad tracks in northeastern Pennsylvania. One of the railroad companies under the PNRRA, the Delaware-Lackawanna Railroad, operates freight trains on the Pocono Main Line and part of the old right-of-way of the Delaware-Lackawanna and Western Railroad. Okay, so now we're finally getting back to the title of this video, this historic train station building in Binghamton. This particular one opened in 1901 and was one of many buildings for passenger and freight services in its vicinity. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad built this station with a unique architecture, inspired by 19th and 20th century revivals, Renaissance, and Romanesque, with an Italian Renaissance-style bell tower. The building is a wonder to see, so it's definitely worth a check. In 1986, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places for its significance. Today, the building houses an ice cream called Scoopy Dooby, and also a social service resource center called Parents and Leaders. However, you can still walk around the building to see where the platform area was for the tracks, which are still there, now used by freight trains. As you can see, there's already one parked right here. So that's about it for today's video. This was definitely a unique one for sure, seeing as it was way outside of New York City, but regardless, I'm glad I came across this magnificent building while I visited Binghamton. As for my next video, I will be heading back to the New York City subway system once again, so stay tuned. And as always, consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I'll see you next time.